Okay, welcome back. This is our Berean and Business Productions podcast, but as well, we're going to be live streaming through the Enoch seminar in Spanish. Can I say that in Spanish?
Sure.
Bienvenidos, bienvenidos, bienvenidos. Estamos aquí con el doctor Mark Nanos, listos para comenzar esta entrevista sobre Pablo dentro del judaísmo. Vamos a estar retransmitiendo esta entrevista a través del Enoch Seminar en español en el canal de YouTube y también en el canal de Facebook. So we're going to be having the interview in English, okay, just to have a more fluent interview. Again, the topic, you can see it right there in the episode. Today, we're going to be talking about Paul within Judaism. And we have here what I can personally say, someone who's been doing a lot of work, as you can see on the thumbnail. He's been writing a lot about Paul within Judaism, Roman within Judaism, and some other Paul's letter. Can we say, Mark, these are the 7 undisputed letters from Paul that you've been doing some work on that?
That's right.
Okay, perfect. So, just to cut to the chase, I'm going to ask Dr. Nanos to introduce himself, just to give us a little background, who he is, what are his credentials, his work, teaching positions, everything. So, Dr. Mark Nanos, welcome once again. You can go ahead and we're going to be listening right now.
Well, thanks. I look forward to visiting with you and your questions, and hopefully I will be clear and helpful for your audience today. Those who know my work know that I've been, my interest in particular in the New Testament is in Paul, and I come to it as a Jewish person who was doubtful that the usual Jewish views of Paul were correct because they were based on the usual Christian readings of Paul. And I think the Christian readings of Paul are likely not correct. Therefore, the Jewish responses are likely to an incorrect reading of Paul.
Yeah.
And this creates a lot of misunderstanding between two communities based on a misunderstanding of a historical figure. So I first had this idea in the 1970s when I was in a Jewish studies university program in a history department. And so reading eschatological and apocalyptic texts, Second Temple texts, and of course biblical texts like Isaiah and Jeremiah and so on, it struck me as a fairly young man that criticism of fellow Jews and especially Jewish leaders was normal Jewish rhetoric. And no one read Isaiah, I think, saying, something like, I don't care about sacrifice. God doesn't care about sacrifices and doesn't care about this or that. He cares about doing the right thing. And I don't think anybody thought, well, then he wasn't a part of Israelite religion anymore. He wasn't into Judaism anymore, to be slightly anachronistic, and that he left it and wanted some other new religion. However, if Paul is critical or disagrees with other Jews and their viewpoints or Jewish leaders, well, then he must have renounced it and was a part of fashioning a new religious institution and way of life. And so I just thought, well, I started to read the so-called eschatological and apocalyptic texts that are attributed to Paul. And I did a paper in 1977. Because I had lived in Greece for a while, I could use Greek. I didn't really know certainly Koine Greek or New Testament Greek, but I could manage my way around enough to see that there were plenty of reasons to be suspicious of the translations and the interpretations, the glosses chosen for the word translations. You have Spanish speakers here. They know quite well that things don't transfer one-to-one, that there are choices to be made, and you make those based on premises that you bring to the conversation and the available glosses, and if you are talking to someone who you think has a certain worldview, you can decode what they're saying differently than someone you don't know, or you think their worldview is something different. So I thought, what if Paul's worldview was more similar to this prophetic type people, and that what he's doing he saw as the best way to do Israelite religion or Judaism, in the same way that Isaiah or Jeremiah upheld, for example. It took me a long time. I became a businessman. I had a small family and didn't come from wealth, and didn't go straight to graduate school. Had I gone at the time, I would have studied with Neusner or W.D. Davies, or one of these figures that are quite dated now, but in the 1970s, they were the leaders. And I didn't know anything about Christian teachers like E.P. Saunders was starting to publish then. I knew nothing about that. But after about 10 or so years, when I started to be able to get back to reading and thinking about this project on Paul, then I learned about the new perspective. So maybe I was 10 years behind on that, some late 80s or so. I was thinking about going to graduate school eventually as what my professor had described as a gentleman scholar in the rabbinic tradition, and financing my own way to study and therefore say things that people might not like, and prevented me from having a career. And that led to me writing what became my first book, The Mystery of Romans. I didn't know I was writing a book, and I didn't know it would be published by such a prestigious press as Fortress and so on. That's a whole story in itself. But the book was well received, won the National Jewish Book Award, was reviewed at the Society of Biblical Literature and Catholic Biblical Association, and in many prestigious New Testament journals and so on, biblical journals. And so I eventually decided to do what I would call ruining my life by starting to do a PhD at St. Andrews. And I did my Galatians work there, which became the irony of Galatians. I sold my business and did some work as a professor and work on my research. And so I had Alan Siegel told me, don't quit your day job. And he was probably right, but I really wanted to do this. And you need an awful lot of time and energy to do it. So that's what I've been doing since about getting close to 30 years ago now.
Yeah.
And during that time, I just kind of feeding to what this topic is, Paul within Judaism. During that time, when I first wrote Mystery of Romans, I hadn't coined a term for this. I wanted to use Christian only as an adjective and only in lowercase. Fortress thought it was acceptable to use it only as an adjective, but not in lowercase. So I have Christian Jews and Christian Gentiles in Mystery of Romans. By the time I was working on Irony of Galatians, I didn't have that constraint, and I didn't use Christian at all if I was trying to be descriptive of the first century situation. Christ following is definitely Christocentric. Definitely, I'm not challenging that Paul believed Jesus was the Messiah at all, and that this made a difference to how he understood the best way to practice the Jewish way of life and to teach it not only to Jews, but to non-Jews who were attracted to the movement. I'm not questioning that at all. Yeah. But as we will talk about throughout this, I really felt it was very clear to me, at least as a hypothesis to be tested, and I'm still testing it, but I'm pretty comfortable with it after this many years, that we really shouldn't interject Christian, because it's misleading. It's another system that did develop, and it does attribute a lot of things to Paul, but I think incorrectly in many cases. So if we just avoid that, we help keep ourselves from being not only just anachronistic, but from creating a worldview that kind of just shifts it in such a fundamental way. And just to give you a simple example, in terms of myself and my project, if Jews would talk about trying to convince another Jew of some messianic proposition, they wouldn't be trying to convince them to leave a Jewish way of life or a Jewish community or anything. But if a Christian tries to convince a Jewish person today, or in 1500 or 1000 or 300, to messianic views about Jesus, they mean for them to leave the Jewish community, Jewish practices, Jewish way of life, and enter into a different system, a different peoplehood, and a different way of thinking, a worldview. That's a conversion from and to. And of course, Paul is considered the quintessential convert in Christianity, and therefore in Judaism, right? That's to try to put on the table. For me, I wasn't using within Judaism, I didn't coin that term to be used for this until around 2011 and 12, when we were pulling together essays we had done at the Society of Biblical Literature. And I had been giving papers and lectures for about 10 years at that point about why we shouldn't talk about Paul and Judaism, but Paul's Judaism. And that has its own problems too. But while we were trying to come up with something to call this in context, Magnus Zetterholm and I offered this suggestion: what about Paul within Judaism? Because that would be a rhetoric that would really get people to pay attention to we were trying to do something different than was what normally is done with Paul. And of course, we can talk about this later as you have some questions, I think, in this direction. But this is how it kind of came about for me. We needed a new way to talk about Paul. Besides not using certain terms, you have to figure out something to say. You can't always write a long sentence or a paragraph every time you're trying to explain and defamiliarize from the familiar in order to make a different point and help people think about it in a different way. So we've been working with this within Judaism for Paul within Judaism. And now, as you know, the New Testament within Judaism, John within Judaism, and so on, is also discussed by the Enoch group. Various scholars are publishing on this and talking about this, and it will have its own developments. But the Paul within Judaism is pretty well placed by now. It's controversial, and it's certainly not the majority view. But if you could go back 30 years ago, the books that were available to look at and the views of Paul that were available, what I was doing looked so deviant as to be almost, so weird, to be almost silly, to actually propose as a historical construction that was scholarly. It was almost laughable for many people. And of course, they would first say, well, yes, of course, Paul was a Jew. But they didn't. Then I would say, well, yeah, but did he like a Jewish person? Did he care about kashrut or something like that? And the answer would be, of course not. So he was a Jew ethnically, but not what we would normally call religiously, not as a conviction, not as a way of life. He wasn't forming communities of people who thought being concerned about Jewish things was the center of their life, but quite the opposite. So this is where we're at now. And now what I have been doing since I started with Mystery of Romans all the way to today, what I worked on is try to do the exegetical work, the detail work, that this hypothesis forces one to reckon with texts, to offer new translations, to consider what they probably meant, and to consider how to communicate that today. And that's really what I focus on, not so much the big picture that comes out and comes along the way, but each of these, what I call, texts that are at the forefront of why people think Paul left Judaism and left Torah, or thinks it's obsolete or even harmful, and so on and so forth. So I'm taking on those texts, and I'm well along. I don't know the percentage, but it's more than half. It's probably closer to 3/4 of the way through those flashpoint texts, Paul and Judaism kind of texts.
Yeah. So there you have it. It's been quite a journey right there from Dr. Nanos and his scholarship. He's not the only one doing a lot of work on this perspective. And of course, it would take some more time to trace the new perhaps not the new, but when scholars, New Testament scholars, started to, applying this perspective paradigm. I'm not sure what word to say, but as you said, this is controversial. And actually, I was the other day just paying attention to. I was listening to a podcast, and Matthew Thiessen, he was being interviewed. I'm not sure what podcast, but he was talking about the within Judaism perspective. But he was just sharing some doubts, questions, and comments. Just to he would like to know a little bit more about this perspective, and perhaps.
Oh, you froze on my end. You've frozen on my end if you can hear me.
Yeah, that was the outage once again.
That's too bad.
Yeah, I don't have power on that, so please bear with me, to all people there. So, yeah, and that's the thing. Now, this thing has been, they've been ironed the whole thing out by providing new work, new books, new research on this perspective. Now, I wanna begin with the first question that we have in mind here in this interview, Mark. So, I would like to ask you, perhaps for you and scholars, this is like second nature. Like you don't have to even think about it. It's just right there, axiomatic, plain as day. But why is it so important to read Paul and his letters within Judaism's, and that's right there, in the first century, Second Temple period? Why is so important, would you say, to laymen like me and some others who's interested in this?
Sure. Well, there's a lot of ways to come at a question like that. That's a big question.
I know. Yeah.
And I'll try to be somewhat concise about some of the possibilities that are actually very interesting to try to tease out. For example, in the Enoch seminar that we had recently about within Judaism, I wasn't able to be on the panel, but tried to listen in and participate a little. Many of the speakers were interested in discussing what do we mean by Judaism, and is that the best term to use? What do we mean by within, and so on. And those are very legitimate. They're things that I've had to go through too. But my interest in this is not around the name. The name is just useful as a rhetoric, because everyone knows, everyone you meet, and probably yourself quite clearly in almost every case, know Paul was not within Judaism, within Judaism, within Jewishness, within, or part of, or representing, however you want to use the exact precise language that you choose. I'm just trying to get at, for me, my usage when it was invented to be used this way. And the reason I still think it is very, very useful is because it's a rhetoric that really puts front and center a question to the normative way of constructing Paul. We all work with construction, and that construction seems to be factual because it's been repeated for a couple thousand years almost now, and everyone seems to think it's accurate.
Yeah.
And even people who do this kind of work tend to slip into that. That's been their training. That they went to school, they went to Sunday school, they went to church, they probably went to church this week. This is the rhetoric they're raised on, and that's the worldview. And so to problematize it centrally in how we talk about that, that's really what I'm after. I like all the other discussions, and I think they're wonderful, and I wouldn't be surprised in the years to come if within Judaism doesn't turn out to be the best moniker for what we're talking about. Wouldn't bother me one bit, but I think it's a really good one right now because it gets right at the issue that, for example, in New Testament scholarship, anything within Judaism, New Testament gets right at the issue. What are we talking about here? That's something different than what we've ever talked about before. Every book you pull down from your shelf that was written before 2015 does not does not have that approach. Now,
No.
are there antecedents? Of course, you have Paul and Rabbinic Judaism, W.D. Davies in the late 1940s, which was formative for me in the 70s. Actually, that was one of the Christian authored books that I did read. But you don't have very many, and they still don't mean the same thing. When you go in and read W.D. Davies, he's still talking about a concept that when the end of the ages comes, the law will be obsolete. So the degree that you think Paul means that, you think that the law is no longer what Paul is introducing people to for guidance. That's just logical. And Matthew Novidson today is doing something somewhat similar to that.
Oh yeah, he is.
But that's not what I mean. I think that Paul thinks the end of the ages is arriving, but it's arriving within Jewish culture. Judaism meaning Jewish cultural ways of life. Jews or Israelites developed for themselves to guide their lives, to guide their worldview, to make who they are in the world obvious, different, and committed to a certain lifestyle, a confession about God and the way the world should be and will be. So when I'm using it, that's what I mean. Okay, so that if we do that by definition, almost we have to talk about the historical.
Yeah.
And try to be as least anachronistic as we can. And another way to come at this is to say, listen, if we're going to talk about somebody, if we're going to talk about Marv and what he means or what he meant, what he's doing, what he means when he uses words, or talk about Mark and what he means when he uses words, we talk about Paul, we should talk about what he probably meant when he uses words. Not what we want them to be, would like them to be, try to manipulate them to be. We should try to be true to him, anyone else. That's just a historical ethic. So in one sense, we need to do that. But in the other sense, and the way that's really relevant, is that Christians talk about Paul looking backwards through the Christian lens and talk about the Jewish other. So Paul isn't the Jewish other, he's the Christian us. If we talk about the first century, before there is a Christian us, there is a messianic group of Jews. I mean, all the disciples are Jews, all the movement's Jews. Jesus only cares about saving Israel. Then that helps a reader, I think, get introduced to a framework of what defamiliarizing, we call it, or refamiliarizing into something different, like you would expect any other Jewish figure in the first century. The other thing about it that's important is the first century prior to the destruction of the temple, because after the destruction of the temple, various forms of Jewishness developed that are different because the political structure. It'd be like if we talked about what happened in the United States if we no longer had the capital. We no longer had the political system we have. What does it mean to be an American? It would fragment. There'd be all sorts of groups. Of course, we have this already, even when we still have the power structure. And that was the case in the first century. But it really changes dramatically after 70 and then again in various times in the decades after, especially the Second Revolt in the 120s. So it's really important in that sense. And I hope that's enough to kind of get, what we're at. It's important not only to talk as historically as we can, but because of what it means. The people who care about Paul, the billion Christians, many of them probably don't care about Paul, but Paul is read in their churches and their liturgy. Paul is a part of their culture. And therefore, getting Paul right, if Paul is different than what they have understood him to be, it's really important that history can do some of that work, or historiography, trying to be as accurate as we can be, which is all probabilities. We're not there. We don't know. We're still interpreting, translating texts, but we're doing so from a different set of premises. And part of those premises are, can we get him historically right, even if he was interpreted very differently later? And that is a part of the historical task, to pay attention to those things.
I would say, Mark, that Paul and Jesus probably, well, I can't be, categorical, but here in the monotheistic West, some people put Jesus and Paul kind of yeah, kind of on the same level, like talking about what they did, Paul expanding Christianity, or and I'm not even sure. And this is something that really drew me to your work, because I'm not even sure if we all should say that Paul. And I'm just trying to think like Pamela Eisenbaum here, but I'm not sure if Paul was, as he was, visiting churches, new places, Rome, whatever, Ephesians. I'm not sure if he was talking that he was like, founding a new religion. To me, as a layman, as I read Paul with the assistance of you, like scholars like you, I read Paul as a Jew, okay, as a Jew, but something has affected his theology, his worldview. And some might say, well, it's because of the encounter that he had with Jesus on the road up to Damascus. And that changed, that's basically the catalyst from which Paul is just like reevaluating his Jewishness. What would you say, and perhaps this is not part of the question, but this is something more of my personal question. What would you say if that is a very plausible reading?
No,
What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's a constructive way to come at this. And let's use figures like John Wesley.
Okay.
So I don't know, many of your listeners will be familiar, but just to be clear, he eventually is credited with founding a new religion. The Methodists come from him, and so on. But what he thought he was doing was going around and trying to get Anglicans to be the best Anglicans they could be, because of convictions he had about what the ideals would be. And later it breaks off and becomes something else. Luther's the same way. What is Luther? He's a Catholic priest.
Yeah.
And he didn't think he was doing something that was not going to be Catholicism. He thought he was trying to reform Catholicism and make it what it ought to be and get rid of the bad stuff. If we approach Paul like that, when he's going around, and if the writer of Acts is even close to accurate, he goes to synagogues. He doesn't go to synagogues to get them to leave the synagogue. We shouldn't use the word church, by the way. It's anachronistic. This Greek word means gatherings. So he goes to synagogues, and within synagogues, when he tries to convince his fellow Jews that this is the way it ought to be, this is really what Judaism should be when the end of the ages starts, which he thinks has begun with the messianic character.
Yeah.
He's not thinking about forming anything new or anything else. The non-Jews join with the Jewish group. They're in Jewish groups. They're in Jewish culture. They're learning to do Jewish ways. And now they learn, oh, we can be a part of this in a fuller way than we thought without, that. So when you think about it that way, that is a paradigm. That is a paradigm change that changes all of this even casual conversation, like your question sort of has a normal casual conversation. Well, deep in that are sets of premises that are guiding what your mind can imagine the possibilities to be. But you change the possibilities when you change the premises, and you change the language in order to help the mind stay there. Yeah. And you don't use churches because that makes people think it's not synagogues. But the same word is used for both. Ecclesia is used for synagogues. It's used for all kinds of meetings in the first century, not just ones we come later to call church.
Church,
and same with the word gospel. Gospel is a normal word. Hey, I've got the evangelion that the olives are arriving in time for the wedding party. That's a evangelion in the first century, that the olives are arriving in time for the wedding ceremony. Now, evangelion is also used politically to describe Caesar, which is
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's a normal
word. Yeah, I didn't know that
word.
The
followers of Jesus didn't own that word. Did it get there? Well, yeah, and we still use it in interesting ways. The gospel of the motorcycle mechanics.
Yeah.
But now we're playing with it backwards. But they were doing that then. It wasn't a backwards thing. And so these are the kinds of anachronisms we can avoid by changing the language and but also the paradigm. I mean, it takes both working, and your brain's going to go back to what's familiar. So it's a really difficult task, even for scholars, to hold themselves to. And one of the things I do in my work is to try to show where scholars see something new and start down the path, but then they deviate back to the same answers that are familiar, because those are the answers that are in their soul from their being when they were a child, what they think they believe in, what they think is real. And so when the evidence sort of goes another way, it's very hard to stay on that new track and not what I would call sabotage it, subvert it by getting to the same end that you would have gotten to without this new insight. You have to really change the paradigm and the language to help you stay there. And then we need each other to sort of say, wait a minute. Do you see what you just snuck in through the back door? A set of assumptions. Paul was doing something other than going to fellow Jews to tell them, hey, I've got a new insight. We can be better Jews. And the end of the ages that we've been waiting for is coming. And in that age, God's going to start reconciling people from the other nations to turn from their God to our God. And that's going to be great for us too, isn't it?
Wow. Just to let you know, because how can I say this? But as you well know, the Romans 9 through 11, the infinite difficult passage, I have Dr. Jason Staples coming in on Thursday to talk about his book that touches on these subjects about, and I'm very interested. And as I am listening to you now, I'm kind of gathering some questions for him, because, I mean, what would you say resurrection and the end of the ages, they go in tandem? Like, these are two subject matters that are informing each other, and it's something within Paul. I mean, the way you read it, you think it's something he has in mind, like on the horizon to come in, or it's something two separate subject matters? How would you, what are your thoughts on that?
No, I think I'm not certain exactly what you're getting at, but I would say for him, he sees the resurrection of Jesus as a proof that the awaited age has begun. It's obviously not here in full. I mean, the empirical evidence is obvious. It's not here in full. The Romans still run the world. People still do nasty things. Good guys lose, bad guys win. It's not the end of the age as envisioned. And the rest of the nations still worship their gods, and Israel is still captive. It's not free. So it can't be empirically proven that the end of the ages has arrived. But if you're convinced through a revelation, not just an argument, because Paul didn't get there by an argument. He says he had a revelation. So that ought to give people pause at thinking that the Jewish people are rejecting something that they know to be true. They're not rejecting something they know to be true. They're rejecting a claim that they do not know to be true, which is being faithful to that which they do believe to be true until they learn otherwise. So when Paul was convinced of this, he was convinced that the resurrection of Jesus kind of inaugurated the age to come, but it didn't complete it. He's waiting for that to be completed. And so he's creating groups, Jewish subgroups, kind of like charismatic groups in a mainline church, so to speak. He's creating subgroup identity, but it doesn't change that he's part of the main body and has to be in interaction and conversation with the main body, and may even be controlled by the main body as to what its limits are. But the idea is they should represent what they claim. They should live in the end of the ages way, which means that the Spirit should guide their lives so that they can live in ways that are not normative. So they can have, for example, differences between genders or ethnicities or income slave free, but they shouldn't discriminate the way that the present evil age, as Paul calls it, discriminates. Now, is that possible? No, it's not possible. Is it something that you should strive for? Yeah. And how are you going to do that? Paul says, by the Spirit controlling your life, by making the other person more important than yourself, by living for the communal goals rather than individual goals, and so on and so forth, which are all things that Judaism already teaches. So what he's doing is just the normal Jewish preacher stuff, but he's making specific claims for Jesus. And now I don't know exactly what Staples would say about that differently. He probably would say something differently, but I don't have any reason to suspect that we would have some major difference of opinion about that. I think the major difference of opinion that we would have is about nomenclature. He's making a big nomenclature difference between whether people should be called Jews or whether they should be called Israelites.
Israelites, yeah.
And that's for me, that would be another topic. We do have difference of opinion about that, but I don't think it's as significant as he thinks it is. In any case, Jews call themselves Israelites and Israelites call themselves Jews. And I call myself an American. I also call myself a United States citizen. And which one I use depends on the salience of the situation.
Yep.
And that's the way I see it. So,
and let me share something of my background here with you, Mark. I am from Honduras, Central America. So we have two words to describe ourselves: catrachos and hondureños, which is the latter is more attached to Honduran thing.
Right.
So, and I can use both in one way or another, and I'm referring to the same person and the same people.
Exactly. And this arises in this whole big conversation that some viewers might get introduced to here or there between whether we should say Judeos is a Jew or Judean, or is it a Judean, which brings the salience of the geopolitical identity.
Yeah.
And a Jew is the geo-religious identity. And can a non-Jew become a Judean by moving to Judea? Yeah. It's a different thing to say if they're not in Judea, can a non-Jew or non-Judean become a Jew? Which is actually very salient for talking about Paul, because this was a development in the Greek period just a few hundred years before Paul, in which a non-Jew could actually become what we now call a proselyte Jew. Mm-hmm. And in that case, they did not become a Judean. And so we can use the same word, and we need to be careful of the context, for just as you do for a Honduran, which one we mean. And our in-house conversationalists from Honduras, they know which one we mean. Yep. Somebody who isn't around can misunderstand it, and somebody talking about them who doesn't even know them can definitely misunderstand it. And you can argue which one you should use, but you're just making arguments that are not necessarily contextually relevant.
Yeah. Okay, moving on. We have another question here, and I'm not sure if you, within the conversation, you already given answers to that, but in your view, Mark, what would be some weaknesses, if any, that the within Judaism perspective face?
Well, there are a lot of obstacles to doing something new, and they're not just obstacles to history, right? So if I had a new view of how we should interpret, let's say, Julius Caesar, or even a religious Jewish figure like Philo in Alexandria, who's a close contemporary of Paul's. He's just maybe a decade or two older than Paul, or 3. It wouldn't matter to people, because they don't look to them for their guidance, for their way of life. They don't internalize their voice as God's word to them. But when we do something with Paul, we're not just talking about a historical figure. We're talking about somebody that you think you already know, and you already know what he says. And so did your mother and father, probably, and your grandparents, and all the people in your life, and your church, and whatever else. And so we're talking about something that is fraught with ideological weight. Of course, there are a lot of objections. And the translations that we use feed to the familiar interpretations. So even until we do a new exegesis and translation of a passage, and then the next passage and the next passage, we're faced with the objection, yeah, well, what about this? He said this, he said that. And I have to say in each case, yeah, well, that's not necessarily the best translation of the Greek. Oh. That's not necessarily the context of what he said. Can we just talk about the new one that I'm presenting to you and not the 10 that you think make it impossible for me to be? That's the kind of issues that we face. We also face the ideological kind of issue, which really is, to me, the most annoying one.
Really?
And that is the misrepresentation of what we're doing and saying. Ooh. And this happens all the time. We call this, in academic speak, we call this informal fallacies. Informal fallacies, misrepresented, or they say he's way over here and they're way over here, but I'm in the middle. There's a very famous guy that all the evangelicals like who does this paragraph. These are the kinds of informal fallacies. Nobody else believes it. Nobody has thought it in 2,000 years. Informal fallacy. It can't be that because that would mean this. And then this is defined in a way from their premises, which is circular reasoning. That could mean something different if we allow a different set of premises and hypotheses and see if they test out. And what you would think would happen with people who really want to know what's in this book, what you'd think would happen is they'd say, wow, I need to investigate that. That's interesting, or that's troubling, or I don't want that to be the case, or something like that, and then investigate it. But that's not what they generally do. Those things are happening, but they don't admit them. What they do is they react and say, that's wrong. And here's why. Do they really actually entertain it? Do they actually do history here? It's really hard to do history when you're dealing with ideology because you don't want that to be right. It's very hard to be open. That's the biggest obstacle that we face. And I face it all the time. And that's why I'm a bit wordy. I can be accused of not trusting my reader or listener. But that's because when my reader or listener gives me the feedback, I see that they didn't really understand what I said, because we tend to then put it into the categories we already have and try to fit it in there over on the sides and make sense. And it doesn't make sense in that category. I'm making a challenge to the whole category. And if you won't go with me and entertain it, I can't get there with you. You can decide I'm wrong, but that's a different decision after you actually pursue honestly to engage it on the level that I made it. This is the biggest obstacle. And when you say that, people can say, what's special pleading or whatever. There's all these kinds of problems. This is the biggest problem.
Yeah. Now, just very, very short question here, but have you faced, like, I'm not sure if I can use this word, but have you faced some sort of caricature of your positions, your views, even either in print or in a conference, lecture?
Yeah, of course it happens, not so much to your face.
Yeah.
I probably don't know most of them, and it's probably a good thing.
Okay.
It would probably hurt my feelings more than I'd like to admit. When I first started doing this as a businessman, a Jewish man without a PhD, as a hobbyist, if you will, going to the Society of Biblical Literature, giving papers, having a book published by Fortress Press, you can imagine there were some caricatures going on. And I think those are still happening. I'm not one of the fancy people. I didn't go to an elite education straight through. I don't teach at Harvard. These are all things that come up in the academy, not usually admitted, but they're real. And
that's interesting.
Also I'm Jewish. There are a lot of Christians, and I'm sure that you've heard this. There are a lot of Christian evangelicals who think a Jewish person couldn't possibly interpret the New Testament correctly. If you don't believe in what it's saying to you, then you can't possibly interpret it. And there are nastier ways of putting that and thinking about that. So those are all real too. But even in academic world, there's ways of trivializing that which you don't like, or somebody who's not like you, or somebody who's a newcomer, or somebody who doesn't have the same credentials. Those things all happen.
Yeah.
And they don't, the one that I do see in print that is troublesome and it falls under the same informal fallacy problem is a kind of an ad hominem, that the reason that I and some others do this is because we want to make Christianity and Paul nice to Jews because it's been so harmful. And one very famous scholar said that we are looking at Paul through how did he put it, through misted up spectacles post-Holocaust.
Oh.
So that we're making a Paul up that we want him to be. And he, of course, instead is just giving Paul the way he is, warts and all, even though it's not so attractive. That's troublesome, not only because of the premises and the unkindness that it presents about an issue that has been quite damaging, that you would think, if you think Paul is that damaging person, you would at least challenge Paul's voice for today's person as not seeing something to give you guidance from, but as something you think is historically accurate, but not what you would teach people to be like. First of all, there's that direction. Second of all, there's a lack of respect for the scholarly other who is doing exegesis that is different than yours and challenging yours. And now you're saying his is ideologically motivated and not real scholarship, not doing history, but you are, as if yours isn't also predicated on an ideology. In this case, this man was not only a Christian, but a bishop. Do you think he doesn't have an ideology that has something to do with what he thinks is legitimate history? So that kind of unkindness and ideological nastiness, if I can say, is very troubling. And unfortunately, what it does is for the unlearned or well, in one direction, the person who doesn't actually go read the other person and see what they're doing, it kind of just censors them. It tells people, you don't need to deal with this because they're extremists over there in a way that your ideology doesn't permit you to really, it shouldn't motivate you to go look at them. They're ideologues and they're doing something damaging to your faith. So just ignore them. So that's one, kind of direction that it cuts off the conversation. So they're not curious about your thing. You're just demonized. You're just over there. You're somehow a threat. That's not really good. That's not really acceptable to me. And there's other aspects of this too that one could talk about, but I won't belabor it further. I think that makes I hope a strong point. Those are the kind of obstacles we face that then just get repeated by other people who don't read us, but just repeat it because a big guy said it, so it must be the way it is.
Yeah. And that's the thing, because I know that it exists, that the so-called consensus, right? The consensus. Yep. I understand the consensus can be good, but what about when it is not useful? It's not useful to my work, my goals. I'm going to just throw the whole thing off because it's not usable anymore, and I'm going to be using the consensus just when it works for me. Right. So yeah, come on, we can do better. So yeah. You have made a good case right now, and I think it's good. So let's move on here, Mr. Nanos, because we want to appreciate your time. And what else do we have? So could you give us, and this is perhaps my favorite question that I just collected here, but could you give us some examples of Pauline passages that, in light of this perspective, Paul within Judaism, take on a new meaning, if I can put it that way?
Oh boy, we needed our time. This is the fun part.
Yeah,
there
give us
are
just one, maybe. Yeah.
So many.
Yeah, I know.
Just to give you a few, in my very first book, The Mystery of Romans, and published in 1996, so we're getting close to 30 years ago.
In a while, yeah.
I of course wrote it before that. One of the chapters that has gotten controversial feedback,
okay,
is a good demonstration. Romans 13 is famous for being read as Christians being told to obey and respect the government and not to challenge them. And that has been used by governments to control people all through Christian history in some very nasty ways, the Holocaust being an example of that too, apartheid and so on. And when I got to that chapter in my book, I used it as a kind of a test case. What if, by the ruling authorities, Paul is talking about the synagogue authorities to whom these non-Jews have never thought that they had to be subordinate. And in particular, if they were resisting some aspects of Jewish cultural life, like, for example, maybe even contributing to the temple, when it was time for when the plate was passed to be anachronistic, because it was something in Jerusalem, what if Paul is trying to enculturate them into a Jewish way of thinking, and the leaders have nothing to do with Roman leaders, whose and many have noticed Paul's language doesn't make much sense of the respect that he shows to the Roman leaders who killed his Jesus and who are making life awful for him and the Jewish people, and now for the new Christ following people. And if you take the normal reading of Christianity right away, they're their enemy too. So there's one that flips it on his head. If you just read it within Judaism and imagine he's functioning these groups or subgroups within Jewish synagogue communities, it turns it on its head. And there's nothing in the language that prohibits it from going that way. And there's quite a bit that could be read that way as tax oriented. So that's one kind of fun example. And to stay with Romans, but with work that I've been doing later than Mystery of Romans, it's collected in my Reading Romans Within Judaism and is ongoing in some essays that are published since that in 2017 or 18.
Yeah.
The olive tree is a very, very good case in point. Where,
what chapter? Yeah, what chapter?
11 of Romans.
11. Okay.
You have the normal translation is that
let me go with the NRSV right here.
Yeah, and you look at verse 17, and then you see that the normal translations talks about branches broken off the tree so that the wild shoot can be planted, grafted in their place, which is replacement theology, quite clearly.
Ooh, yeah.
And it is saying that when you say some branches were broken off, the normal your mind goes to, they're no longer part of the covenant people. They're off the tree, however you define the tree.
Yeah.
Now, when I looked at this and said, but Paul's whole point here is that wouldn't challenge non-Jews not to think of themselves as somehow in a superior position to the Jews who don't believe in Jesus Christ. That wouldn't do that job, but that's the job that the argument here is trying to do. So why don't we re-look at this? So what I did was I looked at the olive culture. I looked at ancient texts, Greek and Latin texts, and I looked at the possibilities for Paul's language here. The word that's translated broken off can just as easily be translated broken, as in bent or cracked, damaged. And we're talking about an olive tree in which the olives are gathered often by tapping on the branches, which can crack or bend or harm them. So it's an image that could, be very salient to people that would know anything about olive culture. And if you're going to graft, by the way, it's one wild shoot. How many branches do you need to move to get one wild shoot in there? So you could bend a couple to get the sunlight and to make room for a graft. and then the graft is actually made into branches, so the branches have to be there, and the Greek word is enaptes, and enaptes means among them or in them, and it refers in Greek back to the broken branches. So if the broken branches are literally broken off and you're grafted among them, you're grafted into the branches that aren't on the tree. That's the Greek.
Oh, that's way
That's pretty
different than I have been. Yeah.
Yeah. So then what we start to talk about is a tree in which the non-Jews are a minor part among and drawing. Then you look at the rest of it, they're drawing from the same root. So you ought to therefore be respectful. And his whole point is, if you're in there graciously, then you ought to be gracious towards the original ones who don't necessarily yet, Paul's view, are not yet convinced of the gospel proposition. So they're not bringing the gospel to you. But they will, Paul is saying. That's my goal. I'm going to make you guys branches that are respectful of the Jewish way of life, of the Jewish people, of the Jewish God. And then my fellow Jews are going to say, he calls it jealousy, they're going to say, oh my, maybe Paul is right and we missed it.
Yeah.
So that's the empirical proof he's trying to create by creating humble, Christ-following non-Jews. And unfortunately, this text serves part of what has been very proud, arrogant Christians saying Jews are out and I'm in. Yeah. Right? Yeah. There's a great case in point where reading it and challenging something that's actually visual is really very important.
Mark, I'm not sure if you, but recently, Stanley Porter and Alan Kirshner, I'm not sure about the last name, but they published it within the Master Biblical Studies, something regarding the replacement stuff. And they point out there that this very passage being used through history by Christians to play down Jewish people. Mm-hmm. And it's been dramatically being used to use it in a very, as you said it, in a very arrogant, condescending way towards Jewish people, which is, my goodness, it's terrible.
It's clearly written for a different. It's written for a different purpose. You can see the whole argument is going somewhere else, and yet here you have this language. So Nostra Aetate in the Catholic Church is saying, they're still part of the people of God, and yet they haven't changed their translation of this text. So the Catholic reader who goes home and reads the text where Nostra Aetate appeals to, verses 28 and 29, they're still our brethren, or the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable. But then the text around it doesn't support that, but it can. And by the way, it says all Israel will be saved in the usual. In fact, you have it in the subheading there, and that's the way it's translated in verse 26. But the Greek word saved, zozo, normally does not mean resuscitated. When a doctor saves you, you don't normally mean you died on the table and he brought you back to life. You use resurrection, maybe, or some other word. But when they say the doctor saved me, that means he kept me from dying. And this word, it means they're kept safe. What Paul is actually arguing is that all Israel is being kept safe during this temporary time of where many Jewish people are not convinced of a claim that is not empirically verifiable. And so they're being faithful, but they're not convinced yet. And you're supposed to live in a way that helps get them convinced. And that has not really happened in the Catholic, in the Christian history.
Yeah.
We can say that. I think if we look at all of this kind of words are the kind of studies that I do to try to show you, here's where he seems to be going. Are there alternatives in the translation and interpretation that would help get us there? And those are some key points. Do you want me to go on further than that?
Please, by all means.
Okay. A really good one that has actually gotten pretty good feedback almost immediately from the academic community is in Philippians chapter 3. Okay. Philippians chapter 3, in the beginning of it, in verses 2 and 3, is normally translated and interpreted in such a way as to suggest that Paul viewed Jews whom he opposed.
What verse would be?
As 2.
Okay.
Go up a little bit. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So it starts there. Beware of the dogs. Beware of the evil workers. Beware of those who mutilate the flesh, or sometimes it's called a mutilation.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this has been interpreted. You can look at any commentary that you like until just the last few years, where some of them begin to cite my new work on this that came out in the late aughts and the early teens. I went back, and what their normal argument is, Paul is talking about dogs, calling Jews dogs here, because Jews called Gentiles dogs, which they appeal to the comments in the Gospels with the Syrophoenician woman who likens herself to the dogs who can eat the crumbs from the table. And they say, therefore, Jews called Gentiles dogs. So Paul is turning it on Jews now as he writes to these Gentiles and calling them dogs and mutilation, calling circumcision mutilation. So that would definitely fit into the Paul has left Judaism and thinks it's really bad and he's doing something else, right?
Yeah.
So I went back and I looked at all of the texts from Jewish texts, everything I could, all the way up through the rabbinic literature. And Jews don't call non-Jews, Gentiles, dogs for being Gentiles. There's no written evidence of that. They call all kinds of people dogs, including themselves, for being fierce and tenacious. They call enemies dogs for being political opponents or for being enemies that have come after them of all kinds. Jews, fellow Israelites, people from the surrounding nations, and so on. It's just like in English language, dogs and bitch and so on are used. And sometimes they're used in a very unprecise way because they're just swear words. They're just things that are used and they're not so accurate. And if you look at the commentary traditions and all of the work based on this, so when I looked at this and the rest of the chapter and what started to go through all of it, actually what makes the most sense here is Paul is referring to various polytheistic, or what we might call pagan, cults present in Philippi that they're supposed to beware of. Nothing to do with Jews and Judaism, because he says we are the circumcision. He self-identifies this group, even though they're not all circumcised, with a part. It's like saying we're within Judaism. We're within the circumcision. Women have had to live with this circumcision thing. You know, they're not circumcised, but we are the circumcision. They can deal with it. And so I think I show that this actually shows, and there's nothing else in Philippians that supposes that there's these so-called, what people call Judaizers. I need to turn on a light. I see I'm getting dark here. The sun is going down. See if this will work.
I can still see you.
Let me see if I can get this to work.
There you go.
There we go. Okay.
Yeah.
Luckily, that was just a coaster.
Now you are in apotheosis.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't catch that. Well, the sun has just gone down out here.
Yeah.
So is that lighting okay? I can't see myself.
Yeah.
Okay.
I can see it pretty well.
All right. And so that's a big challenge. It also, mutilation has been understood to be a reference to circumcision, that Paul thinks circumcision is mutilation. But in the next part, he brags about himself being circumcised. He didn't say he was mutilated.
Yeah.
He says he was circumcised, and we are the circumcision. And so mutilation here is an interesting Greek word, and it actually could apply to several cults. You have the Mother of the Gods cult, which has the males actually cut off their penises as a part of an orgiastic ritual. You have various forms of mutilation, and I go through these in my study. But the word mutilation also actually literally can mean cut, like cut into to the stone. And above Philippi in the hills, to this day, I have photographs of them when I was there. In Philippi, there are actual carvings of pagan gods with dogs, because Diana and Stephanus had dogs as a part of their iconography. And they're certainly evil workers from a Jewish person's point of view. So there's another case. And then I'll just give you one more. It's the one I'm working on, have been working on the last few years, and have published a few things. And now I'm still working on other aspects of it. Now I'm working on the language in Galatians 3 about the curse of the law. Now that sounds like somebody who's, not too keen on the law. And of course, law is not the best way to translate reference if you think that reference is to the Jewish Torah, which is God's guidance for Israel. And does it have laws? Well, sure, of course it does. But laws are kind of good, aren't they? And if we give them space. But God's guidance for Israel, you think that's a bad thing? I don't know. If you translated that, the curse of God's guidance for Israel, it might make you stop and think, oh, maybe it's not actually saying the law is cursed, but the law, the guidance of God does curse certain behavior. And who wouldn't say that? That's pretty Jewish, isn't it? But the word what he's actually referring to is a Greek word ergonomou, and ergonomou is normally translated the works of the law, and the works of the law are normally understood to be, in a traditional sense, human effort to do God's will, either to win God's favor or to boast that you're adequate without needing to be saved. This kind of language. And sometimes it's defined as Jewish rituals that, in the new perspective, that set Jews off from others, a sort of nationalistic or racist kind of thing that Paul is against. But I translate this as the customary rites. And what the customary rites that Paul is resisting are proselyte rites of transformation or conversion, whereby a non-Jew, which is the relevant situation in Galatia, where Paul is trying to dissuade non-Jews who are already followers of Jesus as the Messiah from also becoming proselyte Jews, which is completed by circumcision for males, not for females. And they're called rites because it's not just the rite of circumcision that finishes this, but it's a rites of passage. And that includes being enculturated to a new way of life and going through a process from liminality to completion as a transformed person. Paul's trying to dissuade them from that. And what I think we should just read ergonomou when we confront it, just to help ourselves stay there, as proselyte conversion. It has nothing to do with trying to do Torah. Of course, you're trying to do Torah. If you want to become a Jewish person, you're learning to do Torah. But he's not trying to dissuade you from doing Torah. He tells you in the next chapters that you should love. That's what doing Torah is all about. And he tells you lots of Torah-type instructions, including that you should support those who are teaching you and so on. This is Torah. So Paul's not against Torah, and he's not saying Torah is bad and it creates a curse instead of a blessing. It can create that. What he's saying is people have invented proselyte conversion. It's not in Torah. Do you know that? Most people don't know that.
No.
Torah does not prescribe any rites of passage by which a non-Israelite or a non-Jew becomes an Israelite or a Jew. It's not there. So Paul is the one making the argument from Torah that this is an innovation that creates a curse. And he quotes Deuteronomy 27:26, which basically is saying, if you add anything to Torah, you will be cursed.
Anathema. Yeah.
So he is actually appealing to Torah that he's the one who's teaching Torah accurately by teaching non-Jews they stay non-Jews in Christ. That's the kind of difference reading within Judaism can make with your presuppositions, your premises, the kinds of things you look at, the way you measure other texts, the way you look at the first century Roman, Greek, and so on context in which this Jewish movement is taking place and has to make sense to people. And you suddenly have something that is very different than you will read in any current commentary or book about works of the law or the curse of the law. I think that's a really good example. It's one that I'm working on right now, and mostly I'm getting resistance. No big surprise.
Doesn't matter. Keep it up.
Right.
But this is a very quick question. It's a yes or no question mark. But do you think Paul was a controversial guy within its context? Do you think he would?
I can give you a very simple answer.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay. Good. Thank you. Yeah.
I
So
think in Galatians, he's actually writing to them because when they first knew him, they knew him just as a one-off maverick kind of guy. And now after he's left, everybody else can just say, hey, that guy was nuts. He's doing weird stuff. And now Paul writes Galatians partly because he can say, hey, listen, I've met with the other apostles, and what I taught you is what they agree to also. So I'm not just as weird as you think.
I think the closest you get is when Peter goes on to say, like, this stuff written by the Paul is very it's very hard to understand. It's very hard to get it right there. I mean, so
yeah. That's quite a bit later, probably trying to deal with that. Yeah, but he was controversial from the start. Yeah, he was a controversial figure. He was probably a kind of guy you wouldn't like, both before and after. He was a pretty pig-headed guy. My way is right kind of guy. And he didn't mince words very well. He wasn't super diplomatic.
Yeah. I can say some other things, but let's leave it right there. So, okay. Yeah, I want to respect your time here, Mark. So, last question, and this has to do, and let me just change the picture here because I want to give a plug for your work because you've been doing wow. I'm counting here 1, 2, 3, 4, 8 books. My goodness, this is top notch. So my last question for you, Mark, would be, basically, what's the we as the readers? So we're reading your work, your books, your scholarship about this, Paul within Judaism, many letters, Romans, Corinthians, Philippians. So what do you hope for your readers of your books to take away?
Well, I hope that it will change the minds of people in such a way that Christian culture understands that when it reads the New Testament text like Paul's, it has to do so cross-culturally. These are not written to you in your environment, and they're not written from the Christian perspective that they have developed.
That hurts.
Yeah,
it's not written to me.
Yeah, they're not. They're not. They're written to a whole different people in a whole different time and place and a whole different language.
Exactly.
And it's constructive. You can learn from it, and people of goodwill have a chance to escape some of the anti-Jewish bias that's been built into the conventions for reading and talking about Paul and repeating his language as if it's righteous when it's actually been quite harmful, proven to be quite harmful. And it need not be. There are alternatives. So this is alternatives for you to think about. And there are really not many risks. I'm not saying that you didn't think Jesus was the Messiah and that you should believe in him. What I'm saying is that the cultural values that you would learn were Jewish cultural values. They're not the other that you need to define your Christian self against. They're the other you need to be informed by and inform your Christian self. And so, yeah, that's kind of what I'm after. And in the long run, I'll just give you I lost my father not long ago. And one of the questions he asked my wife when I first started doing this, and he wasn't too happy about it. I was having a successful business, and now I'm going to deal with the Christianity and what am I doing with my life?
Yeah.
And he asked my wife, do you think this will make any difference? And my wife said, in about 500 years, this will just be the way people think about Paul. I hope that she's right, and I hope it's a lot sooner, but I hope that she's right. And it's not just a little blip on the trail to point to in a footnote to say this is not how it is, and it's not how people talk about it. It's still something that they can talk about, but not something that shaped their culture, their way of being in the world.
Yeah. I personally think that we have domesticated. We have a Paul quite domesticated in churches, some other religious contexts. But for the most part, churches. I personally come from a background, very you can call it fundamental, legalistic, religious environment. And I can tell you, many of the stuff just sharing with us here, we don't get to hear that. And I know we can say, well, it's not academia, it's not within the boundaries of scholarship, the ivory tower, But the way you're describing, personally, I can see how it sheds some light on this stuff, how Paul is being portrayed through centuries. And I understand that most of the times people, scholars talking about this issue, Paul, I know, for example, E.P. Sanders' work was like a huge impact. I understand there are some stuff people still, they are like evaluating or moving forward from that perspective, but taking the good points that Sanders might have done in his work. But if I can put it in a very succinct way, we have domesticated Paul, and I will go so far to say we have domesticated the whole Bible. And that has created social loath towards one single group. And as you can say at the beginning of this interview, there are political reasons and structures within the whole conversation. And I can say from me, Mark, that your work, along with some other people work on this within Judaism perspective, should at least, tip us to understand a little bit more that perhaps, just perhaps, we haven't been reading Paul within his context, and we have been imposing our very biases, ideas, concepts, and I would say that we laymen, and perhaps some scholars, but I would go with the layman because I'm a layman. We laymen most of the times end up making a pull up from our reading from his letters. So, but I understand it takes some time.
Yep.
It takes a lot of work. Yep. I mean, it takes investing your money, buying the books, getting yourself and dipping yourself further and further. Because as you read, and you as a scholar, you better understand this than the most of us. But as you're reading, you are surprising. You're finding many surprises, just like the one you just wrapped here, the Olive with the Evangelion, how they will refer that. I didn't know that, and that took me by surprise. Let me tell you that. So it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of work. And I will end up with this. Not everybody wants to be right. But nobody wants to be informed, as good as informed as it should be, because it takes a lot of work. And let me tell you something, Mark. I'm not sure in the States, the United States context, you are more well informed than I do. But let me tell you my context. Here in Latin America, the Spanish-speaking people, we don't like to do the hard work. We don't. We just want to be right, and we just want to go out there and imposing our very own traditional ideas that we were taught since we were just a couple of kids. But we don't want to read. We don't want to do the hard work. We just want to keep the good Apostle Paul domesticated, and that's
yeah, that's interesting. Of course, domesticating is going to happen normative when you are making this a religion of a people, a national religion, as Christianity became, world religion of Western society. But the other thing I would say, I like what you said. Maybe a different way to put it is, Paul is so important because he is sort of the ideal Christian. And if the ideal Christian is one who disparages Jews and Jewish identity and Jewish behavior and Torah and Judaism and how, synagogues and all that stuff, then it's built into Christian identity. That's the ideal. If you change it to Jewish and all of those other things that you change as well, the ideal then challenges the Christian identity that you learned.
Yeah. It's I mean, there's a lot to say about this. I mean, I would like to just go at dawn here with Mark talking about this subject because it's very important. Unfortunately, our time is up.
Right.
And we just want to thank everybody. Everybody will be looking at this video. I will be dropping the subtitles. It will take a while because when you're doing quality work, it may take some time to make it look like that. So, but that's the goal, to bring this content to people who is very interested. They want to know about this. They need to know about this. I rather say, and so they can read it in their own language. I think we need to take advantage of our technology, the explosion, information explosion that we have today, and just make it available for as many people as we can. So that's what we're going to be doing with this content, with this interview. Mark, I just want to say thank you so much for your time. It's been fun. And you have an open platform here for whatever, when you come up with a new book or work, please, if you have time, if your schedule allows you to do it, please just let me know, because this platform is for you, and this platform is for all those scholars, mainly from the Enoch seminar, because that's the focus. But for sure, we can bring some other people that have a lot to say about this subject and more. So we're going to be saying goodbye. Thank you so much, people. Until next time, bye-bye now.
Bye-bye. Thank you.